A young waiter rushed across the restaurant, carrying a tray of steaming plates, when a sudden shout froze everyone in place. "Old man, can't you see where you're going?" "Stay out of the way." The voice came from the new manager. Sharp, impatient, and filled with the arrogance that comes from not knowing the whole story. All eyes turned toward the corner where Baba Jani stood. His white kurta was simple, his shoes dusty, and his hands slightly trembling as he tried to steady himself. He looked like an ordinary elder, maybe someone who had wandered in by mistake. No one could tell, not even the staff, who this man really was. Baba Jani simply smiled, a small, soft smile that carried more patience than most could imagine. He didn't respond. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he stepped aside, quietly folding his hands behind his back. The manager, thinking he had restored order, continued barking instructions to the staff, not realizing he had just humiliated the man who had built the very walls around them. The restaurant was busy that afternoon. Laughter, clinking dishes, music playing softly. But amidst all that noise, Baba Jani's silence spoke louder than any argument could. He took a seat at the far end near the window, watching the world go by outside. He wasn't angry. He was thoughtful. There was a time when this place was his dream, his creation. Every brick, every table, every smile from a customer once meant everything to him. But after retiring years ago and handing the business to his son, he hadn't visited much. He didn't want to interfere. He believed his son needed space to grow. Today, he had only come to see how the restaurant was doing, to quietly bless it and return home. He didn't expect anyone to recognize him, especially the young manager who had joined recently. But the way he was treated cut deep. Not because of the insult, but because it showed how little the world now valued humility and respect. Still, Baba Jani chose peace. He reached for his old walking stick and moved toward a table where a waiter was struggling with a heavy tray. Without hesitation, the old man steadied it with his trembling hands. The waiter looked at him, surprised and embarrassed, but Baba Jani just smiled again. "Be careful, beta. Don't rush. People make mistakes when they forget kindness." His voice was gentle, yet it carried a weight that made the young waiter's eyes drop in shame. From across the room, the manager noticed and frowned. "Sir, please sit down. Don't disturb the service," he said curtly. Baba Jani nodded without protest and quietly returned to his seat. For a moment, everyone around felt something. Guilt, confusion, maybe even admiration. But no one said a word. What no one realized was that this simple, humble man once ran the place with love, respect, and discipline. Under his guidance, every employee felt like family. But time had changed everything. The new generation moved faster, spoke louder, and forgot softer values. 10 minutes later, the door opened and the owner, Baba Jani's son, walked in. He froze when he saw his father sitting silently in the corner. His eyes filled with tears. In a trembling voice, he said, "Baba Jani, you came?" The room went silent. The manager turned pale, realizing what had just happened. Baba Jani smiled again and replied softly, "I came to see if my children are still serving with heart. I'm happy to see the food is good. Just wish the manners were too." The manager lowered his head, speechless. The silence that followed was heavier than any scolding could ever be. Baba Jani stood, gently patted his son's shoulder, and walked out, leaving behind a lesson that echoed long after he was gone. Respect should never depend on appearance. The restaurant had just begun to fill up with the lunchtime crowd. Waiters rushed back and forth carrying trays of food, glasses clinking, conversations rising and falling like waves. In the middle of all that movement, one old man quietly picked up a few broken plates that had fallen to the floor. No one had asked him to help. In fact, a few moments earlier, the young manager had scolded him for being in the way. But instead of walking out with pride or anger, Baba Jani had stayed behind to help clean up a mess that wasn't his. He bent slowly, his knees aching, his back curved with age, yet his hands were steady. He gathered the shards carefully, as if they were precious. The waiter who had dropped the plates stood frozen, embarrassed and terrified that the manager would cut his salary again. But Baba Jani didn't say anything harsh. He simply smiled at the young man and said, "Don't worry, bitter. Things break, so new things can take their place. Just don't break your spirit." The waiter looked at him, startled by the gentleness in his voice. For a second, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade. Everyone nearby saw the old man kneeling on the floor, picking up the broken dishes with his bare hands, while the manager stood at the counter pretending not to notice. The contrast was almost poetic. Arrogance looking away, while humility worked silently. Baba Jani placed the pieces on the side table, wiped his hands, and helped the waiter steady the next tray. "Hold it from the bottom," he said kindly. "Your grip is stronger that way." It wasn't just advice about carrying plates. It was a quiet lesson about life. The waiter nodded, still overwhelmed, and for the first time in a long while, someone had treated him with fatherly warmth. People around began whispering. Some customers smiled softly, touched by what they saw. One woman leaned toward her husband and murmured, "That old man is kinder than anyone here." But most of the staff stayed silent, afraid to speak up in front of their strict manager. They watched as Baba Jani continued to help, arranging chairs that were uneven, picking up a napkin that had fallen, checking if a child nearby had dropped her spoon. There was no pride in his movements, no sign that he thought himself better than anyone. Every gesture was simple, quiet, and full of grace. It was as if he carried an invisible calm around him, the kind that can only come from years of patience, loss, and wisdom. He didn't care who was watching. His peace came from doing good, not from being seen doing it. At one point, the waiter whispered, "Baba Jani, you shouldn't be doing this. You'll hurt your back." The old man smiled. "My son, a little pain is nothing compared to the joy of helping someone." Those words stayed with the boy longer than he could ever admit. Minutes later, the manager returned and saw the scene. The floor clean, the table set, and the old man quietly standing beside the waiter. The manager frowned, irritated that someone had done what he should have assigned. "You again? Why can't you just sit quietly? You're disturbing the staff," he snapped. But Baba Jani didn't react. He simply looked at him, eyes gentle but steady, the kind that make you question your own tone. Then he said softly, "I didn't mean to disturb, Beta. I only wished to help." That one sentence, simple and calm, carried more dignity than any title or position could. The room fell silent again. As he turned to leave, the waiter quickly whispered, "Thank you." Baba Jani placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Remember, respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn by the way you treat people weaker than you." That afternoon, long after Baba Jani left, The waiter kept hearing those words in his mind. Even the customers felt a strange warmth when they spoke of the old man. His silence had changed something in that place. Without raising his voice, without defending himself, Baba Jani had taught everyone in the room what true dignity looks like. Quiet, humble, and deeply human. The door to the restaurant opened with a rush of warm air and chatter. The staff looked up as the owner stepped in. A young man in a tailored suit, confident, smiling, and full of energy. He had been away for a few weeks, managing new branches in other cities. The manager hurried forward to greet him, straightening his tie nervously. "Welcome, sir," he said, eager to impress. The owner nodded politely and began scanning the restaurant, his sharp eyes moving across the tables, the customers, the service. And then, suddenly, he froze. At the far corner of the room sat an old man in a simple white kurta, hands folded, gaze soft. A quiet presence in a noisy space. For a moment, the owner couldn't believe what he was seeing. His heart leapt into his throat. "Baba Jani," he whispered. The entire room fell silent. The sound of forks and glasses stopped mid-air. Even the music seemed to dim. The manager blinked in confusion, unsure if he had heard correctly. The owner, with tears forming in his eyes, rushed toward the old man and knelt beside him. "Baba Jani, you came. You didn't tell me." The entire staff turned to look at one another, realization dawning slowly, shame following close behind. The old man who had been scolded earlier, who had quietly helped clean the broken plates and offered kind words to the waiters, was not a random stranger. He was the father of the very man who owned the restaurant, the same man whose portrait hung proudly in the office, framed with a garland on opening day. The founder, the one who had built everything from nothing. The manager's face turned pale. He stepped back, his chest tight with guilt. Just a few hours ago, he had shouted at the man who had built the place he now worked in. He remembered his harsh words echoing back in his head. "Don't get in the way, old man." And each syllable now felt like a stone pressing down on him. The waiter he had scolded earlier looked down, ashamed, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The owner gently held his father's hands. "Baba Jani, you didn't tell anyone you were coming. We would have welcomed you properly." Baba Jani smiled softly. "Better. I didn't come for attention. I just wanted to see how the house feels when the father is away." His words carried no anger, only quiet love and a trace of sadness. The owner turned toward the manager, his voice trembling. "Did you know who he is?" The manager shook his head, eyes filling with tears. "Sir, I didn't know. I'm so sorry." The old man looked at him and said gently, "You don't need to apologize to me, Beta. You didn't know. But remember this. Never measure a person by the clothes they wear or the work they do. You can't see a man's worth through pride." The silence in the restaurant grew deeper. Even the customers sitting nearby seemed to feel the weight of the moment. Some watched quietly, some lowered their eyes in respect. The waiter who had been helped earlier by Baba Jani stepped forward and said, "Sir, he's been here helping us all morning." He picked up the broken plates himself. The owner's eyes filled with pride and pain at once. "That's my father," he said softly. He built this place with his own hands. And even now he's teaching us all how to serve with heart. The manager's eyes overflowed as he fell to his knees. "Please forgive me," he said. Baba Jani placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Forgive yourself, not me. Just promise you'll never speak to anyone with arrogance again. Respect comes before rank." In that moment, every person in that restaurant felt smaller, not in a bad way, but in the kind of way that humbles the soul. The truth had been revealed, and with it came a powerful reminder. Greatness doesn't shout. It whispers. And sometimes the most ordinary-looking person in the room carries the greatest legacy of all. The air in the restaurant felt heavy after the truth was revealed. The staff moved quietly, almost afraid to make a sound, while the owner still stood beside his father, trying to process the moment. Baba Jani sat calmly, his face peaceful as always, though his eyes held a depth that spoke of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. The manager, still trembling from guilt, stood a few steps away, his voice caught in his throat. He had realized too late the mistake that pride had made him commit. But Baba Jani wasn't angry. Not once did his tone change. He simply looked at the young man, as if seeing not his arrogance, but the child behind it. Lost, rushing, trying too hard to prove himself in a world that rewarded pride more than respect. After a long silence, Baba Jani spoke, his voice steady, quiet, but powerful enough to make everyone stop what they were doing. "Better," he said to the manager. "In life, you'll meet two kinds of people. The ones who make you feel small, and the ones who remind you how big your heart can be. Always try to be the second one." The manager's eyes filled with tears. He couldn't speak, only nodded, feeling the weight of every word press into his conscience. Baba Jani slowly stood up, leaning slightly on his walking stick. The owner moved forward to help him, but he waved him off with a gentle smile. "I can walk, son," he said softly. Then, turning to the room, to the waiters, the cooks peeking from the kitchen, the customers who had silently witnessed everything, he continued, "You see, respect isn't something that belongs to power. It belongs to kindness. A uniform, a title, a position, all these can be taken away. But the way you treat another's soul, that becomes your real identity." Everyone listened. There was no clinking of glasses, no movement of trays, no background music. Only his voice, calm and sure, filling every corner of the restaurant. He didn't sound like he was lecturing. He sounded like a man who had lived through every word he spoke. The owner watched him with pride and a hint of pain. He had spent years trying to grow the business, to modernize it, to make it bigger. But his father had just reminded him of something more important than success: humanity. Baba Jani looked around one last time. The same restaurant he had built years ago still smelled of his memories. The laughter of customers, the first meal served, the joy of feeding others. Now it was filled with new faces, a faster rhythm, but the essence was still there. He smiled and said, "I built this place with love, not just wood and bricks." Remember, if the heart of a place is lost, the walls will mean nothing. The manager lowered his head, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve forgiveness, sir." Baba Jani placed a hand on his shoulder. "Forgiveness is not something you deserve, Beta. It's something you give yourself when you decide to change." That single line made even the customers emotional. Some had tears in their eyes, reminded of their own parents, their own moments of pride and regret. Before leaving, Baba Jani turned toward his son and said, "Take care of this place, not just as a business, but as a home. Feed people's hearts, not just their stomachs." His son nodded, his voice trembling. "I promise, Baba Jani." The old man smiled, patted his shoulder, and began to walk toward the door. The staff stepped aside, heads bowed in respect. As he reached the exit, he paused, turned back one last time, and said with a soft smile, "Never look down on anyone. Time changes faster than pride fades." Then he walked out into the sunlight, his figure slowly disappearing beyond the glass doors. Inside, no one spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was cleansing. The manager wiped his eyes. The waiter folded his hands in silent prayer, and the owner stood still, realizing that the greatest lesson his father ever taught him wasn't in business or success. It was in humility. That day, Baba Jani didn't just teach a restaurant how to serve better. He taught a generation how to live better, with respect, with patience, and with love that asks for nothing in return. As Baba Jani walked away, the sunlight touched his face. Soft, golden, peaceful. The sound of his slow footsteps faded, but the silence he left behind spoke louder than any noise. The manager watched from the door, tears in his eyes, whispering to himself, "I'll never forget this day." The restaurant felt different now. Not just cleaner, but lighter, warmer, almost sacred. The owner stood still, his father's words echoing in his mind. "Respect doesn't come from power, it comes from kindness." He looked around at his staff, their faces changed, humbled. Everyone knew something had shifted forever. That day, no lessons were written down, no speeches were made. Yet everyone who saw that moment carried a story home. A story of a man who said little, but taught everything. Because some people don't need to shout to be remembered. They just walk away, leaving respect in every step.